Gather closely, my dear. The world is full of shadows, but the darkest ones, they don't hide in forgotten alleys or abandoned woods. Oh no. The most terrifying monsters sit right across from us at the family dinner table. They smile. They pour the tea. They call us mother and father. Our story begins in the bustling, neon-lit heart of Hong Kong, in the early days of March 2013. The air outside was thick with coastal humidity, the streets humming with the endless, frantic rush of millions of intertwining lives. But we are going to drift up into the quiet, breathless confines of a dense apartment block in Tai Kok Sui. Specifically, the Hoi-Leung building on Kok Chung Street. A building made of concrete and shadows, where secrets can easily be swallowed by the thin walls. Picture them, if you will. Chau Wing-ki, a 65-year-old father, and his devoted wife, Shu Yu-yi, who was 63. By all outward appearances, they were a perfectly ordinary, weary retired couple. They had worked their entire lives, raised 2 sons, and were finally supposed to be slipping into the peaceful autumn of their years. Like many parents, they worried. They loved, perhaps in that heavy, demanding way that parents sometimes do. Mr. Chau liked his television loud, drowning out the silence. Miss Shu was a mother who pushed, who had once forced her young boy to sit at the piano until his fingers ached, desperate for him to be extraordinary. And then, there was that boy, their youngest son, Henry Chau Hoi-Leung. At 29 years old, he was a young man with quiet, deadened eyes and a mind wound up tight like a rusted spring. To his aging parents, he was simply flesh and blood, a son who had struggled with his studies, who had been bullied abroad, but who was finally finding his way. So, when Henry extended an invitation to them on that fateful first day of March, their hearts must have fluttered with a quiet, mundane relief. Henry told them a wonderful little lie, a lie so beautifully ordinary that it slipped past any parental defenses. He told his mother and father that he had finally taken a big, responsible step. He had rented a brand new flat of his very own, and he wanted them to be the very first to see it. He told them he needed a little help to clean, to pack, to settle into his new beginning. What mother, what father, would ever refuse such a gentle request? They wanted nothing more than to see their youngest boy succeed. Imagine the scene as they prepared for this visit. Ms. Shu perhaps dressing with a little extra care, while Mr. Chau grumbled mildly, but was secretly proud. They made the trip to Tai Kok Sui together, moving closer and closer to the Hoi-Leung building. They didn't know that the flat they were traveling to didn't belong to Henry at all. It belonged to his friend, a man named Angus Tsay. And it was not a sanctuary of new beginnings, my dear. It was a meticulously prepared slaughterhouse. As they rode the cramped elevator up, the parents were completely blind to the abyss waiting for them just beyond the threshold of the wooden door. But Henry was not waiting inside with a proud smile. He was waiting with a cold, hollow emptiness in his chest. A terrifying void where a son's natural love should have been. For months, he had been nurturing a monstrous, wicked seed in the dark corners of his mind, watering it with bitter resentment, feeding it with every perceived slight, every argument over that loud television, every forced piano scale from his childhood. As Mr. Chau and Ms. Shu stepped off the elevator and walked down the dimly lit corridor, their footsteps echoing slightly on the linoleum, they were no longer just parents visiting a child. They were lambs. Soft, trusting lambs walking willingly, lovingly, right into the jaws of the wolf they had raised by their own hands. The door clicked open, groaning slightly on its hinges, and the trap was sprung. They stepped inside, the door closing behind them with a heavy, suffocating, final thud, shutting out the rest of the world forever. What happens in the mind of a boy before he decides to butcher his own flesh and blood? It doesn't happen overnight, my dear. No, true evil is a slow, creeping rot. It starts as a tiny, black seed of grievance, nestled deep in the damp, dark soil of an insecure heart. For Henry Chau, that poisonous seed had been quietly germinating for nearly 30 long, suffocating years. You see, Henry looked in the mirror and saw a ghost. A phantom of a man who had reached his early 30s with absolutely nothing to show for the breath in his lungs. No grand, respected career. No sweeping, passionate romance. No independence. Just a hollow echo of a life. But the human mind is a fragile, desperately defensive thing. It is so much easier, so much more comforting, to point a trembling, accusatory finger outward than to look inward at one's own failings. Henry couldn't bear the agonizing weight of his own mediocrity. So, with a terrifying, quiet resolve, he took that crushing burden and placed it squarely onto the shoulders of the two people who had given him life. He blamed them for everything. Every single stumble, every bitter rejection, every agonizingly lonely night. He convinced himself, with the fervent delusion of a zealot, that his mother, with her stern expectations and relentless pushing, had systematically dismantled his spirit. Remember the piano? The beautiful instrument that is supposed to create soaring, emotional melodies? To Henry, it was a wooden cage, a torture device. He claimed his mother forced him to play, day after day, week after week, commanding him to pound the heavy ivory keys until the music twisted into a discordant, maddening symphony of pure hatred in his mind. He felt she had stolen the very essence of his childhood, replacing any innocent joy with an unbearable, suffocating pressure to be a prodigy he simply wasn't capable of being. And his father? Mr. Chau was a man who, in Henry's increasingly twisted perception, was an arrogant, overbearing presence that blocked out the sun. Henry despised him with a visceral, physical revulsion. He despised the way his father watched the television, the way he breathed the air in their home, the very way he existed in the world. In Henry's warped, shrinking reality, his father's mere presence was an unforgivable insult, an emotional anchor tied to Henry's neck, dragging him down into the black depths of failure. But perhaps the most potent, volatile poison in Henry's mind was the deep, gnawing ache of his empty heart. He craved love. He craved the touch and understanding of a partner. But the women he desired looked right through him, sensing the unseen, unsettling anger that vibrated beneath his skin. Yet, instead of looking at his own reflection and recognizing his own social inadequacies, he concluded that his parents were the ultimate, wicked saboteurs of his romantic life. He genuinely believed that the way they had raised him, the emotional scars they had supposedly inflicted, had rendered him fundamentally unlovable. He convinced himself that as long as they were drawing breath on this earth, he would be cursed to wander it alone, a tragic outcast in his own miserable story. This was the twisted, terrifying gospel Henry preached to himself every single night in the pitch black of his room. A toxic, relentless litany of blame and victimhood. He began to view the couple down the hall not as his mother and father, not as human beings who had fed and clothed him, but as parasitic monsters actively feeding on his potential. They were the source of all his pain. And once you strip away the humanity of another person, my dear, once you reduce them to the physical embodiment of your own misery, well, the unthinkable suddenly becomes entirely possible. The resentment bubbled over, boiling away any last, desperate drop of filial piety. It wasn't enough to simply pack his bags and move away. It wasn't enough to yell or to cut ties or to never speak to them again. In Henry's rapidly decaying mind, the universe itself was fundamentally out of balance, and a terrible, bloody debt was owed to him. They had stolen his life. He reasoned in the suffocating silence, and therefore it was only fair, only perfectly just, that he take theirs in return. The thought no longer made him shudder in the dark. Instead, it began to make him smile. A cold, detached, terrifying smile. The struggling, frustrated son was dead and gone. In his place, something hollow, calculated, and infinitely hungry had taken the wheel, steering him quietly and irreversibly toward a horrific, jagged edge from which there would be no return. When does a dark, venomous fantasy curdle into a fatal reality? It rarely happens in a sudden, explosive flash of lightning, my dear. No, the most terrifying evils are born of terrifying patience. For Henry, the decision wasn't a sudden snap of the mind. It was a slow, deliberate, icy exhalation. The clock of his parents' doom began ticking down exactly 6 months before that fateful day in March. Half a year. I want you to truly think about that for a moment. Imagine waking up every single morning for 180 days, sitting across from your mother, drinking the warm tea she poured for you, looking into her aging eyes, and knowing exactly how you are going to extinguish the light behind them. That does not require mere anger. That requires a soul entirely devoid of warmth. As the humid summer of Hong Kong faded into the autumn of 2012, while ordinary people were rushing to work and living their vibrant lives, Henry was retreating deep into a shadow world of his own making. He wasn't simply plotting a crime of passion. He was organizing a grand, macabre project. He became a diligent, obsessive student of death. He began to map out the logistics of slaughter with the cold, sterile efficiency of an accountant. How does one make 2 fully grown adults simply vanish into thin air from one of the most densely populated cities on Earth? Henry knew the answer required isolation, tools, and an unfathomable amount of stomach-churning labor. And so, the grotesque shopping trips began. Oh, imagine the sheer, breathtaking audacity of it all. Picture this quiet, unassuming young man walking the brightly lit aisles of ordinary hardware stores and appliance shops. He rubbed shoulders with smiling newlyweds and weary mothers running their mundane errands. But Henry's shopping list was written in the ink of nightmares. He needed blades, sharp, heavy meat cleavers, and specialized knives, tools specifically forged to hack through the stubborn, wet resistance of bone and sinew. He bought thick, heavy-duty chopping boards. He loaded his cart with vast, unnatural quantities of coarse salt, not for a festive family feast, but for the ancient, grim purpose of drawing moisture from dead, decaying flesh to mask the sweet, sickening stench of his sins. Most chilling of all were the large appliances. He knew the sheer, physical volume of 2 human bodies would be impossible to hide in a standard apartment. So, he arranged for the delivery of extra, second-hand refrigerators. He purchased microwave ovens and mountains of ordinary plastic lunchboxes. He was not outfitting a cozy bachelor pad, my dear. He was meticulously constructing a clandestine abattoir, a domestic slaughterhouse hidden away behind a cheap, unremarkable wooden door in Taikok Sui. Every time Henry handed over the cash to a clueless cashier, every time a delivery driver unknowingly brought another piece of the puzzle to that flat, Henry was pulling the noose a little tighter around his parents' necks. What freezes the blood is the sheer, sociopathic patience of it all. He sat at the family dinner table, listening to the loud television his father loved, and he simply smiled a secret, terrible smile. He let his mother fuss over his future, knowing full well that he had already written her final chapter. He lived a flawless double life, a quiet, disappointing son on the outside, and a meticulous, cold-blooded butcher on the inside. He mapped out the angles of the room. He calculated the timing of their arrival. He planned the chemical cleanup. He left absolutely nothing to the unpredictable hands of chance. For 6 agonizingly long months, Henry Chau lived comfortably alongside the ghosts of his parents, waiting with the breathless, unblinking stillness of a spider for the calendar to finally flip to that doomed, bloody day. But a monster, my dear, rarely likes to work in complete solitude. The sheer, terrifying physical labor of making 2 entire human lives disappear is simply too heavy a burden for one pair of hands. A project so grotesque, so profoundly unnatural, requires an extra set of muscles. It requires a willing partner in the dark. And so, to bring his blueprint into the bloody, breathing world, Henry needed an accomplice. Someone pliant. Someone who wouldn't ask the right, moral questions, or someone whose own internal compass was just as rusted and lost as his own. Into this suffocating story steps Se Chun-Kei, a man often known to the world simply as Angus. He was a few years older than Henry, but in the ways that truly matter, he was cut from the exact same discarded cloth. Angus, too, had fallen through the jagged cracks of Hong Kong's demanding society. He was considered by those who knew him to be isolated, naive, and desperately, tragically easily manipulated. If Henry was the cold, calculating architect of this macabre design, Angus was the perfect, unquestioning contractor. They were a match made in the darkest, most desolate corner of hell. Picture the 2 of them together. 2 societal outcasts, sitting in dimly lit rooms, feeding off each other's bitter failures. They would whisper their endless grievances against a world they felt had brutally wronged them. Henry, with his sharp, poisoned tongue, became the dominant force in this deeply toxic friendship. He spun his intricate web of deceit and hatred, slowly convincing Angus that this horrific act was not just simple murder, but a necessary, logical step. He manipulated the lonely man's desperate need for companionship, forging a twisted, unbreakable brotherhood in the deep shadows of the city. Together, they secured that apartment in Taikok Sui, completely transforming it from a simple living space into an active, breathing staging ground for slaughter. Imagine the 2 of them working side by side in that cramped, stifling flat. The windows were sealed tight, heavily taped to block out both the warm sun and any desperately prying eyes of the neighbors. Heavy, light-blocking curtains were drawn permanently, trapping the stagnant air inside. They worked like diligent ants building a nightmare. Together, they moved large, second-hand refrigerators into the kitchen, the heavy compressors humming a low, droning death march in the dead silence of the flat. They stacked hundreds of ordinary plastic lunchboxes into neat, terrifying towers. They lined up the newly purchased, brutally heavy meat cleavers on the counters, testing their edges, and hauled massive bags of coarse salt into the corners of the room. The atmosphere inside those walls must have been absolutely surreal, my dear. Just imagine it. Two men, perhaps sharing a simple meal of takeout noodles, chatting about entirely mundane things, all while casually stepping over the instruments they would soon use to butcher human flesh. Angus didn't run away in terror. He didn't secretly pick up the phone to warn the authorities. Instead, he willingly helped Henry lay down the protective sheeting. He helped him arrange the thick wooden chopping boards. He allowed himself to become entirely complicit in the terrifying countdown. As the first day of March finally approached, the flat on Kook Chung Street was no longer a home. It had become an airtight, soundproof tomb, patiently waiting for its occupants. The elaborate trap was fully set. The rusty jaws of the steel were pulled back to their absolute limit, held in place by a single thread of pure malice. The dark alliance between Henry and Angus had successfully transformed a venomous fantasy into a cold, hard, physical reality. The stage was perfectly set. The butchery tools were gleaming in the dim light. All that was missing now was the bait. The morning of March first arrived with the deceptive, mundane brightness of any ordinary day. The sun rose over the towering skyscrapers of Hong Kong, casting long, reaching shadows across the bustling pavement. Down below, swallowed by the sea of a million hurrying strangers, walked Chau Wing-Ki and Shu Yu-Yi. They moved with the familiar, synchronized rhythm of a couple who had spent decades side by side. Perhaps they bickered lightly about the humidity, or perhaps they walked in a comfortable, weathered silence. They were merely a mother and a father, navigating the crowded streets, making their way toward the Tai Kok Sui district. They were walking toward their son. They were walking straight out of the world of the living. Try to put yourself in their worn, sensible shoes for just a moment, my dear. As they approached the drab, imposing concrete facade of the Hoi-Leung building, their minds were likely filled with a mixture of quiet pride and mild, parental anxiety. Henry, their struggling, frustrating, deeply loved boy, was finally showing some initiative. He had a flat, a place of his own. They probably expected to find a messy room, clothes strewn about, perhaps a stack of unpacked boxes. They brought only their presence and their enduring hope. They had absolutely no idea they were crossing the river Styx. They entered the dim lobby, pressing the tarnished button for the elevator. The doors slid shut with a metallic scrape, isolating them from the noisy, chaotic safety of the street outside. As the cab groaned upward, carrying them floor by floor, the air seemed to grow heavier. Finally, the elevator lurched to a halt. The doors parted, revealing a quiet, narrow corridor illuminated by the harsh, flickering buzz of fluorescent lights. And there, standing at the end of the hall, was Henry. He wore a mask of absolute, chilling normalcy. A calm, relaxed posture. A soft, welcoming expression that completely hid the rotting, blackened abyss of his soul. He greeted his mother and father, perhaps offering a slight nod, a gesture of hollow respect. He turned and led them down the linoleum hallway toward the heavy wooden door of the apartment. The trap was laid out right in front of them, yet it was entirely invisible to eyes blinded by unconditional love. Henry reached out, his hand steady and cold, and turned the key in the lock. The deadbolt slid back with a sharp, heavy clack that echoed in the quiet hallway. He pushed the door open and stepped aside, gesturing for the two people who had breathed life into his lungs to enter the dark, waiting belly of the beast. As Mr. Chau and Ms. Shu crossed that fatal threshold, The very atmosphere of the room must have felt fundamentally wrong. The air inside was stagnant, trapped behind heavily taped windows and thick, drawn curtains that ruthlessly choked out the midday sun. It did not smell like a fresh start, my dear. It smelled of industrial cleaning supplies, of raw, coarse salt, of cold, metallic anticipation. There was no comfortable furniture, no warm, welcoming touches, just the harsh, unnatural hum of those large, second-hand refrigerators echoing from the kitchen space, and the eerie, unblinking presence of Angus Tse, waiting quietly in the shadows. But the human mind is a tragic, beautiful thing. It desperately seeks to rationalize the bizarre. Miss Chau might have looked around the stark, unsettling room and simply thought her son was unprepared. Mr. Chau might have frowned at the heavy curtains, wondering why the boy sat in the dark. They stepped further into the room, their backs turning toward the exit. And in that fleeting, agonizingly fragile second, Henry reached out and quietly, firmly pulled the heavy wooden door shut. Click! The deadbolt was thrown from the inside. The sound was impossibly small, but in the suffocating silence of that apartment, it was the deafening roar of a judge's gavel. The outside world was entirely gone. The illusion of the loving family reunion dissolved into thin air. As Henry turned to face the backs of his aging parents, the mask of the dutiful son completely melted away, revealing the cold, unblinking eyes of a predator who had finally, successfully cornered his prey. The waiting was over. The heavy thud of the deadbolt sliding into place was the last sound of the ordinary world Chow Wing Ki and Shu Yut you would ever hear. For a fraction of a second, the apartment hung in a bizarre state of suspended animation. The elderly couple, still wearing their sensible walking shoes, still breathing the stagnant air of the meticulously sealed room, slowly turned around to face their son. They expected to see Henry, the boy they had fed and clothed and worried over for nearly 3 decades. But the entity standing between them and the locked door was no longer their child. It was a stranger with dead, empty eyes and a heart of absolute ice. Before the confusion could even fully bloom on Ms. Chau's weathered face, before Mr. Chau could even open his mouth to ask why the heavy curtains were drawn so tightly against the bright midday sun, the trap violently snapped shut. There was no grand, theatrical villain's speech, my dear. True, premeditated murder rarely has the dignity of a cinematic dialogue. It is sudden, it is chaotic, and it is unspeakably brutal. From the dark, suffocating shadows of the room, Angus Tse moved. The compliant friend, the willing accomplice, stepping forward into the dim light like a phantom. And Henry, the architect of this living nightmare, closed the distance to his parents with a terrifying, unnatural speed. The weapons, those heavy, gleaming blades they had so carefully purchased during those mundane, everyday shopping trips, were suddenly drawn and ready in their hands. Imagine the sheer, mind-shattering shock of that very moment. The psychological betrayal is almost worse than the physical blade itself. To look into the eyes of the infant you once cradled in your arms, the toddler whose scraped knees you tenderly kissed, the young man whose future you prayed for every single night, and to see nothing but a cold, calculating intent to extinguish your life. Miss Chau did not see a monster from a fairy tale. She saw her Henry. Mr. Chau did not see a shadowy, faceless assassin. He saw his own flesh and blood raising a hand against him. In an explosion of sudden, breathless violence, the two men struck. They lunged at the unsuspecting, fragile couple. There was no time to scream. There was nowhere to run. There was nowhere to hide in that sealed, taped-up tomb. The dark objective, meticulously planned for 6 agonizingly long months, was executed with a ruthless, sickening precision. The cold steel of the blades found their terrible marks. They aimed for the throat, a swift, devastating, fatal severing of life. The air, previously thick with the dry smell of coarse salt and harsh cleaning supplies, was instantly overwhelmed by the sharp, warm, metallic tang of copper. The struggle, if there even was time for one, was agonizingly brief. How could a weary retired couple in their 60s possibly defend themselves against 2 young men armed and fueled by a bottomless, boiling well of festering hatred? They simply couldn't. The sheer terror in their widening eyes must have been paralyzing. The agonizing realization that their final breath was being violently stolen by the very boy they had given breath to. And then, the horrible gravity of the act took hold. Their legs gave out beneath them. The life violently drained from their veins, spilling out onto the cold, unforgiving floor of the Thai Kok Sui apartment in dark, rapidly expanding pools. The parents collapsed, their bodies hitting the ground with a heavy, deeply final thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the sealed room. And then, silence. A thick, suffocating, ringing silence roared back into the room, broken only by the ragged, heavy, adrenaline-fueled breathing of the 2 butchers. Henry Chau stood over the crumpled, bleeding forms of the people who had brought him into the vibrant world. He didn't drop to his knees in sudden, crushing remorse. He didn't scream in horror at what he had just done. He simply stood there, his chest heaving, gripping the bloodied handle of his weapon, staring down at the lifeless husks at his feet. The bloody deed was done. The heavy anchor he believed had been dragging him down was finally cut. But as he looked at the sprawling, catastrophic mess covering the floor, Henry knew the true, stomach-churning nightmare was only just beginning. The slaughter was complete, my dear. But the work, the horrific, unthinkable work, was about to commence. Look down at the floor with me, my dear. See the absolute, horrifying stillness that follows the frantic, bloody chaos of murder. The silence in that sealed flat in Thai Kok Sui was no longer just empty air. It was heavy, suffocating, practically vibrating with the magnitude of the ultimate sin that had just been committed. Henry Chau and Angus Tse stood amidst the expanding, dark crimson pools, their chests heaving, their eyes adjusting to the gruesome new reality they had so carefully brought into existence. To any normal human being, the sight of one's own mother and father lying lifeless, their throats violently slashed, would shatter the mind into a million irreparable pieces. A normal son would drop to his wet knees, wailing, tearing at his face, completely consumed by an ocean of instantaneous, crushing regret and madness. But Henry was not a normal son. He did not weep. He did not scream into the stagnant air. He simply breathed in the sharp, warm, metallic stench of copper that now coated the back of his throat, and his eyes flatlined into something entirely cold and reptilian. The psychological detachment required for what came next is a darkness that defies all human comprehension. Henry looked down at the bodies of Chao Wing-Ki and Shu Yu-Yi, and he consciously stripped away the final shreds of their humanity. He no longer saw the hands that had fed him or the eyes that had watched him grow. He saw a terrifying logistical problem. He saw evidence that desperately needed to be erased. He saw nothing but meat. Without a word, the 2 men shifted from murderers to butchers. They moved with a chilling, robotic, and sickening efficiency. The grand, macabre shopping trips of the past 6 months were finally reaching their grotesque crescendo. From the shadowy corners of the room, they retrieved the heavy, thick wooden chopping boards they had bought. They laid them out on the floor, creating a makeshift, domestic abattoir right there on the linoleum. They picked up the specialized, razor-sharp knives and the heavy, brutally thick meat cleavers. Imagine the sheer, terrifying physical exertion required, my dear. Human bodies are not fragile, easily broken things. They are dense, stubborn constructs of heavy bone, thick muscle, and tough sinew. To dismantle a human being takes immense, back-breaking effort and a sickening, relentless persistence. And Henry applied himself to the horrific task of dismembering the very people who gave him life with the cold, dead-eyed focus of a factory worker on a midnight assembly line. And oh, the sounds. We must think about the terrible sounds. The sickening, wet thwack of heavy steel forcefully biting through flesh and striking the thick wood underneath. The sharp, resisting crack of bone. The terrible, slippery sounds of tearing and separating. These were noises that belong only in the darkest, most blood-soaked depths of an industrial slaughterhouse, not echoing inside a residential apartment building in the heart of Hong Kong. Yet, because of the meticulously taped windows and the heavy, drawn curtains, the neighbors remained completely, blissfully ignorant. They went about their evening, watching television or cooking their own family dinners, entirely unaware of the unimaginable butchery occurring just inches away on the other side of the concrete wall. Angus Tsay did not shy away from the unimaginable gore. The compliant friend worked right alongside Henry, their hands completely slick with the blood of the innocent, their shoes slipping on the wet floor. They worked in a grotesque, silent tandem, separating limbs from torsos, reducing a weary mother and father into a horrific, unrecognizable collection of fragments. Hours bled away in that sealed, stifling room. The physical toll was massive, but the emotional toll remained chillingly blank. But as they looked upon their butchered work, they knew the coarse salt and the sharp blades were not enough. The scent of death is a stubborn, lingering ghost that would eventually betray them to the outside world. To truly make his parents disappear, Henry knew they had to turn to the stoves and step into the absolute most monstrous phase of his 6-month blueprint. Come closer, my dear, because this is where the mind truly begins to fracture and recoil. The physical exhaustion of dismantling 2 adult human beings is immense, but what followed in that cramped, sealed apartment was a descent into an abyss of absolute, unimaginable depravity. The floor was slick, the air was heavily choked with the sharp scent of copper, but Henry Chau and Angus Tsay were far from finished. They gathered the heavy, unnerving fragments of what used to be Chau Wing-Ki and Shu Yu-Yi and carried them away from the linoleum floor and into the small, entirely unremarkable kitchen. A kitchen meant for boiling simple noodles and steaming rice was about to become the epicenter of a suffocating culinary nightmare. They desperately had to deal with the inevitable biology of their crime. Death, my dear, is a very loud, very stubborn thing. It announces itself to the world through the air. To silence that creeping, undeniable stench, they turned to the massive, heavy bags of coarse salt they had so meticulously stockpiled weeks prior. Imagine the horrifying, sickening intimacy of it. Henry, taking large, abrasive handfuls of the white crystals and aggressively rubbing them into the cold, butchered flesh of his own mother and father. He worked the coarse salt deep into the grain of the meat, utilizing an ancient, desperate method of preservation designed to draw out the moisture and violently halt the inevitable rot. The sheer, terrifying domesticity of the act, like a morbid chef preparing a grand, grotesque roast for a holiday feast, is enough to make the warmest blood run absolutely ice cold. But Henry, with his fractured, obsessively calculating mind, knew that simple salting wasn't enough to completely hide the evidence of his sins. If anyone were to somehow breach that locked door, the raw, visual truth of the butchery would be entirely undeniable. So he enacted a plan so sick, so profoundly twisted, that it permanently stains the soul just to think of it. He reached out with blood-stained fingers and turned the dials on the stove. Click, 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 whoosh. The blue gas flames roared to life in the dim, heavily curtained flat. They placed the large pots and pans upon the burning iron grates. And then, with hands steady and eyes completely devoid of human light, they began to cook. They weren't merely trying to burn the evidence away, my dear. No, Henry's dark blueprint was far more psychotic, far more calculated than that. He intended to camouflage his atrocity in plain, mundane sight. He and Angus began boiling and searing the dismembered pieces, deliberately and methodically attempting to alter the texture, the pale color, and the smell of the human flesh. Their chilling goal? To make the remains of Mr. Chau and Ms. Shu perfectly mimic a common, everyday staple of Hong Kong cuisine, barbecue pork. Think of the sheer, suffocating madness echoing off the walls of that tiny kitchen. The loud sound of sizzling fat. The heavy steam rising into the stagnant air, carrying a scent that was fundamentally wrong, deeply unnatural, yet violently masked beneath the guise of a heavy, greasy, domestic meal. Picture Henry Chau standing over the roaring stove, the blue light of the gas flame flickering across his impassive, mask-like face. He stirred the heavy pots. He turned the searing meat. He was boiling the very woman who had forced him to practice the piano, the very man whose television habits he had so bitterly, intensely despised. He reduced their entire existence, their lifetime of hopes and worries and parental sacrifices, into a grotesque, sizzling mockery of a takeout dinner. The apartment must have grown unbearably hot, the sealed air thick and choking with the humidity of boiling water and the unspeakable, sickening grease of their horrific labor. They worked for agonizing hours, standing over those roaring flames, actively turning their horrific crime into something they genuinely believed they could hide in plain sight. The psychological barrier required to stand there, breathing in that thick, cursed steam without completely losing one's mind, is a terrifying testament to the absolute void where Henry's soul used to reside. But as the long, dreadful cooking process finally began to wind down, and the fires were extinguished, the massive, horrifying volume of their work still remained on the counters. The meat was cooked, my dear, but it still needed to vanish from the world completely. And Henry had already prepared the perfect, mundane vessels for their final, undignified rest. Now, my dear, we must look at the aftermath of that unholy kitchen. The fires had finally been extinguished. The sickening, heavy steam that had coated the walls in a greasy film began to slowly settle in the stagnant air of the sealed apartment. But the terrifying physical reality of what Henry Chau and Angus Say had done still covered the countertops. The dismembered, boiled, and salted fragments of Chow Wing Ki and Shu Yut Yu were no longer recognizable as the loving parents who had walked into that building just hours before. They had been reduced to an agonizing logistical problem, a grotesque puzzle that desperately needed to be hidden away from the prying eyes of the waking world. And how does a monster hide his sins? He doesn't bury them deep in the woods or cast them into the dark, churning ocean. No, Henry chose a method so breathtakingly mundane, so chillingly domestic, that it completely defies all human sanity. Do you remember the mountains of ordinary plastic lunchboxes he had so meticulously purchased during his 6-month descent into madness? Those cheap, simple little containers, the exact kind a mother might lovingly use to pack a sandwich for her child's school day, or a weary husband might take to the office. They were brought out from the shadows of the living room. Picture the two men, their hands still slick with the horrific grease of their labor, standing under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent light of the small kitchen. They opened the plastic lids one by one. Pop, pop, pop. A sound so utterly normal, so everyday, echoing in a room completely devoid of humanity. With a cold, robotic detachment, they began to pack the cooked flesh into the containers. They methodically arranged the pieces, snapping the plastic lids tightly shut, sealing the unspeakable horror inside perfectly ordinary, rectangular tombs. The sheer volume of their grim task was staggering. Box after box after box was filled. It was an assembly line of pure, unadulterated evil. They wiped down the greasy outsides of the plastic, ensuring no stray drop of blood or moisture would betray the terrible secrets held within. And then they turned to the large, second-hand refrigerators that had been humming their low, droning death march in the corner of the room. Henry pulled open the heavy, insulated doors. The cold, sterile air rushed out, meeting the suffocating humidity of the blood-soaked apartment. And then the stacking began. They carefully, methodically placed the sealed lunch boxes onto the wire shelves, one on top of the other, row after row. A terrifying, sickening game of Tetris played with the physical remains of the very people who had given him life. They packed the refrigerators so full, so densely, that there was scarcely room for a single breath of air between the plastic containers. When the very last box was finally wedged into place, Henry pushed the heavy refrigerator doors shut. The magnetic seals engaged with a soft, final smack. And just like that, the gruesome, undeniable evidence of his parents' existence was locked away in the cold, dark, humming belly of the household appliances. The apartment fell quiet once more. The chaotic, bloody frenzy of the slaughter and the sickening, roaring heat of the butchery were officially over. Henry and Angus stood in the dim, heavily curtained living room, entirely alone. They began the arduous, exhausting process of scrubbing the linoleum, bleaching the heavy wooden chopping boards, and wiping away the dark, expanding pools that had soaked into the floorboards. They worked in a heavy, exhausted silence, believing with the absolute, arrogant certainty of a sociopath that they had committed the perfect crime. They genuinely believed that by simply packing their parents away like leftover takeout, they had erased them from the universe. But the universe, my dear, has a very long, very unforgiving memory, and the ghosts of the Hoi-Leung building were already beginning to whisper. Every monster eventually stumbles, my dear, and it is rarely a brilliant, sweeping investigation that brings them down. It is almost always their own blinding, suffocating arrogance. Henry Chau truly believed he had committed the perfect, flawless crime. He believed he was smarter than the police, smarter than society, a dark, misunderstood genius standing high above the ordinary world. And for a few fleeting, agonizing weeks, he played a truly sickening game of hide-and-seek with the entire city of Hong Kong. When his older brother rightfully panicked over their parents' sudden, inexplicable disappearance, Henry put on the chilling performance of a lifetime. He went on local television, my dear. Can you imagine the sheer, breathtaking audacity of it? He sat before the bright, unblinking studio cameras, his face carefully arranged into a mask of deep, agonizing worry. He looked right into the lenses and pleaded with the public to help find his missing mother and father. He lied with the smooth, practiced ease of a serpent, knowing exactly where they were. He knew the cold, humming refrigerators and Thai Coke Sui held the gruesome, plastic-wrapped truth, yet he shed crocodile tears for the very people he had butchered. But the ego of a killer is a fragile, desperately needy thing. It craves an audience. Henry could not simply sit quietly with his monstrous, heavy secret. The pressure of his own perceived brilliance built up inside him until he simply had to boast. He turned to the digital world. In a casual, everyday WhatsApp group chat with his friends, a place usually reserved for mundane chatter and video games, Henry typed out his own damnation. He nonchalantly confessed to the slaughter. He explicitly called himself a psychopath. He typed the words, telling them he had murdered his parents and needed a little time to say goodbye to his friends before the police inevitably caught him. It was a digital breadcrumb of pure, unadulterated hubris, dropped carelessly for the waking world to find. The police, already deeply suspicious of his shifting timelines and bizarre, cold demeanor during interviews, immediately pounced. The authorities descended upon the Hoi-Leung building. They breached the heavy wooden door of that sealed apartment on Kok Chung Street. The moment the hardened, veteran detective stepped inside, the illusion was shattered forever. The air, despite all the bleach and frantic scrubbing, still held a faint, sickly sweet undertone of salt and decay that made the officer's blood run absolutely cold. They found the heavily bleached chopping boards. They found the blood-stained receipts for the immense bags of coarse salt and the large, gleaming blades. And then, with trembling, gloved hands, they opened the heavy doors of the refrigerators. There, stacked in perfect, terrifyingly neat rows, were the hundreds of ordinary plastic lunchboxes. The horrific, domestic camouflage was violently stripped away, revealing the dismembered, cooked remains of Chau Wing-Ki and Shu Yu-Yi. The macabre kitchen had finally been dragged into the unforgiving light of day. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. In the spring of 2015, Henry Chau sat in a sterile courtroom, his face entirely blank, devoid of any human warmth or remorse, as the horrifying details of his 6-month blueprint were laid bare for the world to judge. The jury saw right through his desperate attempts to claim insanity. He was found guilty of 2 counts of cold-blooded, calculated murder and sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life rotting in a concrete cell. His accomplice, Angus Tsay, was surprisingly acquitted of the murders, with the jury believing he had been heavily manipulated and terrorized by Henry's dominant psychosis, though Angus pled guilty to the grim, undeniable charge of preventing the lawful burial of the bodies. And so, our dark tale comes to a close. Henry Chau wanted to be free of his parents, and in his twisted, psychotic pursuit of absolute freedom, he ensured he would never, ever walk free again. Remember this story, my dear, the next time you sit down for a warm family meal. Look closely at the familiar faces across the table. For the most terrifying monsters don't lurk in the distant shadows. They smile at us over dinner.